to try to contribute at 80% in your relationship. Knowing it's impossible.
The math does not work.
The math totally doesn't work. There's no such thing as a 160% whole. But the idea is that aspirational shift can have this really powerful effect where you begin to change the underlying culture of marriage and relationship from one of fairness and resentment to something more like what we call radical generosity, where you're looking for how can I contribute? How can I create more connection and love in my relationship?
Welcome to the 1000 Days Sober podcast. My name is Lee Davy. I am not an alcoholic. I refuse to be anonymous. I am alcohol free as fuck. I live a self-led life and I spend every single moment of the day helping other people do the same. Like right now. How are you doing out there, brothers, sisters, queens, kings, magicians, lovers, whoever you are? Hope you're doing really well. Now, for me, when I became someone who was alcohol free as fuck, it wasn't the ending of something, it was the beginning of something. I didn't know it back then. Honestly, when I stopped drinking, I thought I had cracked some motherfucking amazing life code. And I did, but it wasn't as powerful as I thought it was. And the wake-up call that I received was my second wife saying, "Hey, Lee, I want a divorce because I think you're a bit of an idiot." I wasn't drinking then. So it's like, hang on a minute, I've stopped drinking, and yet my wife wants to divorce. What's going on here? And it was a real wake up, like I said, because I realized that just being alcohol free as fuck wasn't enough. There was another part of the equation that I was missing if I wanted to leave my mark on this world. And I don't know what that is going to be, but sure as shit, I want it to at least be that I was the best husband and the best father that I could be, right? And here was my wife telling me that that wasn't happening. So for me, the gateway into living a self-led life, if you like understanding that I wasn't very conscious, or I certainly had like multiple levels of the consciousness video game to go up, even though I'd stopped drinking alcohol, was really important to me. And doing everything that I could in my power to improve the way that I showed up in a relationship with my wife was like so important. And this is why I love having guests on the show like Nate and Kaley Klemp, because people who have worked through and who are continuing to work through their relationship problems and write about it and share about it, the successes and the failures, it's really important because it really accentuates our growth and our development, right? And Nate and Kaley Klemp have put everything that they learn into a book called The 80-80 Marriage, a new model for a happier, stronger marriage. And I really, really like the book. I really like the idea and the ethos of the 80-80 marriage. It really challenges you. You cannot exist in an 80-80 marriage if you're not aware of your levels of consciousness or not, right? So if you've like just recently become alcohol free as fuck, or you're in the process of this and you're in a relationship, reading books like The 80-80 Marriage, listening to podcasts like today, taking the advice of Nate, Kaley Klemp, and my good self, and putting that into effect is absolutely huge, right? So I hope you get a lot out of today. And if you're not in a relationship with anyone yet, please still listen to this because you're in a relationship with yourself, right? And the way that we want to show up in the context of life and relationships with people externally is the same way that we want to show up internally with our little inner child parts, okay? All right, so I'm going to give you a little bio, a little flavor of what Nate and Kaley Klemp is all about. Like I said, they are the authors of The 80-80 Marriage, but Nate is also the co-author of a New York Times bestseller. It's called Start Here, Master the Lifelong Habit of Well-Being. He holds a BA and MA in philosophy from Stanford University and a PhD from Princeton. Kaley, now she is one of the nation's leading experts on small group dynamics and leadership development. She's also a TEDx speaker and the author of 3 books, one of them which is absolutely blew my mind, and we work on it and use the principles of it a lot in the STRIDE method. That's the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. She also wrote or co-wrote the Drama-Free Office and 13 Guidelines for Effective Teams. She is a graduate of Stanford University, where she earned a BA in International Relations and an MA in Sociology with a focus on organizational behavior. All right. So we're going to get into the weeds today about relationships and what it means to exist or create an 80-80 marriage. I hope you really enjoy it. If you want to get in touch with the Klemps or in touch with me, let me know and I will sort it out for you. So without further ado, I'll shut the hell up and leave you in the capable hand of Nate and Kaley Klemp. So Nate and Kaley, thank you very much for joining me. The 80-80 marriage. I recently finished it. I thought it was amazing. As somebody who is in my second marriage, if I keep doing them, I'll get better at this maybe. I'm always really interested in relationship books. First and foremost, can you explain to the people at home the 80-20, the 50-50, and now the 80-80 marriage principles?
Okay, well, maybe we'll tag team this. Let's start with the 80-20 framework of marriage. Think 1950s, Pleasantville, your grandparents or your great-grandparents. The 80-20 model is basically this model that many of us have inherited. It might have been the model of our parents. And it's the model that says one partner, typically the woman, is responsible for contributing to the relationship, but also to the household at around 80%. And the other partner, typically the man, gets away with something more like 20%. And the good news is that in this cultural moment, we have at least partially transcended that model. There's a residue that sticks around. Women still do more all the time. Study research says that. But for the most part, our aspiration has now shifted from 80-20.
So the improvement was, let's get to a place of fairness rather than this wild inequity where one person does everything, the other person coasts, to be equals and in love. How can we do that? Well, the math is, let's make it fair. Let's make it 50-50. And we like to say that the aspiration of that was a good try. The problem is 50-50 doesn't work because there is no point where you can actually measure and say these things cancel each other out. The trip to help a child in the middle of the night because they're scared. Well, how many times do you have to take out the trash to make that fair? And there are so many things that we don't see. So emotional labor is this great example where it's not just, did you drive your child to a birthday party or did you celebrate Father's Day? It's, did you think through the present, the driving, the timeline, how that connects to the rest of the weekend for either one of those, the birthday party or the father's event? So it's impossible to measure and people fight all the time about fairness.
Yeah. So we like to say that's sort of our current time slice. That's where we are today. That we are the first generation in all of human history where the question is, how can we be equals and in love? And that is our default answer as a culture. Let's just make it 50-50. The alternative model, what we call the 80-80 marriage, is based on the idea that what if we did something radical to just blow up that whole system of 50-50 and all the resentment that follows in its wake? And to do that, the idea is, what if you were to try to contribute at 80% in your relationship? Knowing it's impossible.
The math does not work.
The math totally doesn't work. There's no such thing as a 160% whole. But the idea is that aspirational shift can have this really powerful effect where you begin to change the underlying culture of marriage and relationship from one of fairness and resentment to something more like what we call radical generosity, where you're looking for, how can I contribute? How can I create more connection and love in my relationship?
I love that. Thank you very much. I'm going to touch a little bit on the 80-20 and then the 50-50, and then we'll dive in the 80-80. I had a client very recently in the last couple of weeks who he really wanted a baby and his wife didn't want one, but eventually he talked her into having one. And then he was like, dude, I didn't realize this would be so much work. And I was using your model. And I was saying to him, hey, where do you see yourself on the 80-20, 50-50, 80-80? And he said, dude, to be honest with you, I'm the 80-20 guy. And I was like, whoa, this still happens?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I want to say to that is I think I have ended up in both of my relationships on the 80-20 when I was very, very unconscious. like I ended up there and I didn't want to be there, but I realized I was, and it all just happened very unconsciously. So it is incredible how, I don't know, did you come across this in your studies? Like the generational habitual societal conditioning that just you see your dad behaving to you, behave the same way. Did you come across that with the 80-20?
That's exactly it. And that's where we talk about the cultural hangover that, exactly as you've described, the vast majority of modern couples are not saying, I would like to take advantage of my partner. I would like to coast in the relationship. Nor are they saying, I want to do so much more than my partner and then resent them for it. And yet we do model on what we've seen. And so if the example was, and this actually showed up early in our relationship, if the example was that I saw, well, the woman does everything and then she doesn't say anything about it, then I just went ahead and did everything and didn't say anything about it, except that we want to be equals and in love. And so then the resentment tale was brutal.
Yeah. Did you ever get into martyrdom? That's one thing that I used to get is my wife would say, you don't do any, I do all this stuff. And I would just, in my mind, I'd be like, oh my God, you're such a martyr. Did you ever get into that one?
Yeah, there's a dynamic that we see a lot. We call it the over contributor and the under contributor. And the over contributor, that's the one who's doing everything, not saying anything, not asking for help, but maybe there's this tale of resentment or nagging that comes with that. The over contributor will often fall into that martyr role. And the under contributor will fall into this role of actually having their own flavor of resentment, which is maybe they actually do want to contribute. Maybe they actually don't enjoy being the one who's the problem, being the one who's not doing enough. But often they're disempowered to such an extent that they don't even know how to do it. And so they just give up. That was certainly our situation. You know, I was the under contributor. Kaley did everything and she was good at everything. And she expected me to help, but often didn't give me the tools to do it. So I adopted this stance, and many under contributors do, where I said, you know what? Nothing I do will ever be enough for you. So I'm just not going to do anything.
I mean, I think that the tiny examples in some ways are the best. So take something as small and insignificant as the dishwasher, where if every time someone, Nate loads the dishwasher, I reload it because he's done it wrong, I'm essentially training him not to load the dishwasher. Well, then I'm super mad that there are dishes in the sink. Like, why didn't you just load the dishwasher? He's like, because it doesn't matter. Every time I load the dishwasher, you redo it and then you're mad. So your choices are to be mad or to be mad. I'm just going to not do anything and let you be mad.
I love the way you say that the issues are in the small things and not the big. You talk about potholes and sinkholes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm in the 6th session of a 12-session program with one of my clients, right? Mm. And it's all been around the dishwasher. I kid you not. When I first said, he said, I don't know how you're going to help me fix my marriage. And I said, just tell me the fight you just had recently. Yep. And it was over the dishwasher. And what has materialized, and he never thought that this would happen, is the control issue. Like himself is like, he's realized that there's a safety and a security in loading the dishwasher and taking charge of it, because it actually leads to something greater, which is approval, approval, security, control.
Yes, like, of course.
He needs approval. So he needs people to come into his house and be like, oh, this is a beautiful, spotless house. And it all comes from the dishwasher. It's incredible, isn't it?
It's amazing how the tiny things in some ways are examples of the larger pattern. So you can work the larger pattern or you can work the example, and either way you get to the central issue.
Well, and there's a trap there where there are couples we have worked with where they think to themselves, if I just do something big and amazing, then I'm going to create all the love and connection that I need in my relationship. So I'm going to plan this amazing trip to New Zealand, or I'm going to get tickets to Taylor Swift, something huge and extravagant. And it often doesn't really change the underlying dynamics of the relationship because, as you said, those micro moments are the connective tissue.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just have like this one shock and awe moment that's amazing and expect all those micro moments to somehow align themselves. You got to look at the dishwasher, to your point.
That reminds me of my parents, actually. My father will do something left field, which is pretty big for him. So, for example, he'll book a holiday, a vacation to Spain or something, and then my mum won't appreciate it, and my dad will then go ape because she didn't appreciate it. And it really boils down to, why don't you just ask? Why don't you just ask what she needs? And because he's incapable of doing that, he guesses and gets it completely wrong.
Yeah.
Yep.
In some ways, you've actually just touched on 3 key ingredients to an 80-80 relationship. So the 3 ingredients are contribution, appreciation, and revealing. And so in your example, contribution is all the little ways that you show up and give in your relationship. And so this can be, do you load the dishwasher? Do you ask a question? Do you help out? Do you volunteer? Like, what are the ways that you're striving to contribute? And when your partner does that, do you appreciate it? So this is, we think about it like a scavenger hunt. You find what you're looking for. If you're looking for all the ways your partner messed up and why the fork should be down instead of up in the dishwasher, or how you should, turn the hot water on, or whatever it is, you find the mistakes. But if you're looking through a lens of appreciation, you also find the things that are amazing. So in the example with your parents, the big trip to Spain got met with resentment rather than, wow, thank you for thinking of me. But the third piece, where I think it's the unlock, is that revealing. Do you know what your partner wants? Are you asking the bigger questions about, what do you care about? What's really going on with you? Would Spain feel relaxing and connective, or would Spain feel stressful because it's a huge trip? And so this sense of, do you know what's really going on? I think those are 3 essential ingredients to an 80-80 mindset.
Yeah, when I know my parents, there's a lot of resentment there because they've never really engaged or been taught really healthy lines of communication. So a lot of the time it just gets stuffed under there. And the only time it will come out is when they've had a drink, which is a disaster. For me, when I've not received appreciation and I've wanted it, I now understand that comes from resentment. So nobody's going to appreciate me if they resent me, no matter what I do. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Resentment in a relationship and how toxic it could be?
Resentment is often the tail of fairness. So we were talking before about the 50-50 mindset and this arrangement where I'm counting methodically all of my amazing contributions, and then I'm comparing them to what I think Kaley's doing, but I often don't have a very clear picture of that. We can dig into that later. But as a result, there's this resentment. I'm doing more, she's doing less. It's not fair. And then resentment often triggers all sorts of unhealthy behaviors in relationships, because rarely do we communicate it in a healthy way that's sort of bringing us back into connection. Usually it comes out sideways. It's passive aggressive. It's me attacking Kaley. It's Kaley telling me that I don't load the dishwasher correctly, which, by the way, has happened many times, hundreds of times.
The example is real.
So the dishwasher is real. So then the question, though, becomes, okay, well, what do we do with resentment? How do we navigate it more skillfully? And that's where that practice of revealing that Kaley mentioned a moment ago becomes really powerful, because it's going to be expressed. The question is it expressed in an underhanded way that pushes your partner away and makes things worse and leads to conflict? Or is it going to be expressed in a way where it's an opportunity for you to grow together? And that's where a practice where you can say something like, hey, Kaley, I know that the alignment of bowls on the top of the dishwasher is super important to you. But in this moment, I'm really stressed. I'm late for a meeting. I just needed to put this bowl in. And the way that comment landed, like, I just felt kind of controlled and a little bit frustrated. And so maybe every once in a while, you let me go on the dishwasher thing. Maybe like once every 3 times you can make that comment. Is that something we could work with?
What actually happens in real life is he says to me, he goes, "Oh, I thought I was so close to perfect. Maybe next time."
Well, I like that because that sounds like it's a little bit of humor, right?
Yes.
So what I find
Exactly.
what I learned a lot from your book was there's this control issue that comes up in relationships, which likely comes from observing your parents. Maybe your dad controlled your mom, and you as the daughter was like, I'm never going to let that happen to me when I get older, whatever. But there's a power trip that kind of goes on in a relationship. And talk about that a little bit, because I think that's really important, because this whole thing around the dishwasher, et cetera, it feels to me, you didn't use this terminology in your book, but it feels to me very masculine, right? Like we're both in our masculine energy and we're boom, boom, boom. But if I introduce a little bit of humor, which I feel is more feminine, and then a feminine and my wife's talking very masculine and very structured, it goes well together. So just touch upon power a little bit there, and humor maybe is an antidote to that.
We think about power as an exercise in balance. And so exactly as you're describing, that can be a masculine, feminine balance. That can be a humor, serious balance. It's when it comes at it where both people are grabbing for the power and or trying to one up the power that you end up with so much conflict. There's also something really beautiful that you've talked a lot about, awareness. And the first part of the 80-80 marriage is really about the mindset that's essential to have these conversations. Do you have a mindset of radical generosity toward your partner? Are you looking for the ways that you can get aligned? That's a first step and an essential one. But then there's a bunch of structure that shows up in support of these relationships being able to work in the real world. That it isn't just like, we're going to mindset our way to bliss. Power is a structural component, and balancing power starts with, do we want to be generous toward each other? But then it's a question of who does make the call? Where do decision rights live? And why are we loggerheads around the dishwasher seems to be the example of the day, or other bigger decisions in life. And so being able to see who cares more, but also being able to see, why does one person have power in this situation? Is this about money? Is this unconsciously about giving to the other person or withholding? We'll sometimes see that in the realm of sex. But as you're describing, Lee, I think the question you're asking is, when we notice a power struggle, it's worth having some awareness around what's really going on and how can we balance instead.
Yeah, and the way that I've been approaching that is really just trying to cede control as much as I can, and or keeping my mouth shut when my inner child is activated through control. Because I've noticed what happens in my relationship is Liza will show up in what I call this masculine energy, which is usually when she feels unsafe in the relationship, or like I vacated that pole almost, like I need to step in and be the man here because my man is not the man. And so she'll step into that, and this might just be in the conversation, and she'll say something and I'll feel, oh my God, that was so aggressive or passive aggressive or underhanded or whatever. And I used to react. Now I let it go and I silence myself, and she'll say something really funny in the next moment. And I'm starting to realize that just let it, she's not attacking you, Lee. She's behaving in a certain way, but she's not holding on to it like it's an attack. So why do you? Does that make sense?
I think what you're describing is what I would almost call relationship jujitsu, which is an essential practice. And the reason it's essential is we like to talk about how relationships either go down by accident or they go down by design. By accident, the way we communicate is our partner comes at us with a certain energy. Maybe it's that masculine aggression, maybe it's resentment, maybe it's anger. And our brain is literally wired to mirror them back. In psychology, they call this complementary behavior or social contagion. It's a well-known feature of the brain that if somebody's really angry at you, you get angry. I mean, that is just how we're wired to be. So what you're describing, and this is in many ways the ultimate move of being in a relationship with somebody, can you in that moment just see the anger, see your reaction to the anger, and then before you have that zinger that comes out of your mouth, that's like, oh, I'm gonna get her now with this one, stop controlling me. I'm not your employee or whatever it might be. I don't know what your favorite zinger is. I like those. But before that zinger gets launched, if you just take that moment to shift, and maybe the shift is, to your point, just letting it go. Maybe the shift is humor, getting back to that, like what I will say to Kaley occasionally. I really am trying to be perfect. And one day I think I'm going to get there. Maybe when we're like 85, but I'm still working on it. All of a sudden, the whole dynamic changes. And so that's this peculiar feature of mindset in marriage, that we're often mirroring each other. And if one person can break out of that mirror-like tendency, then the other person now has permission to relax, and you can kind of laugh a little bit. And instead of getting a raging fight, you just move on to the rest of your day and you stay connected.
Have you ever read How to Fix Your Marriage Without Talking About It, or something like that it's called?
No, I don't. I'm not aware of that book.
So they talk about shame and safety. So when you're in a conflict, they use a generalization, but it's a bit of framework. It's been really helpful. Mm. It's like the woman will come from a place of safety and the man will come from a place of shame. So when you use humor as an example there, Nate, what I used to do, and I still do obviously so much, but I'm trying not to, is Liza will say something to me which will activate my shame. Mm-hmm. And then I will respond from that little part of me trying to protect myself from that shame. And then because I do that, she feels really unsafe and we end up in that vortex. When I use humor, like you just said, oh, maybe one day I will get it. I will get this right. Liza feels safe because I'm using humor. I'm not going into my inner child. So now she's like, oh, he's in what I call self energy. He's remaining in self energy so I can feel safe. And that's the relationship that I want. Getting it is another thing entirely.
I think you described that really, really well. And the space to choose is the difference. And finding that moment where you can notice, oh, that would be my shame talking, or that would be my insecurity talking. Breathe and either reveal it, use humor, come back to connection, remember your values, take a pause, pet the dog, like something that then helps you come back in a skillful way. And that seems like a really beautiful adjustment. And what I love about what you're saying is that if we can break the negative spiral of our energy being contagious, we can shift to our positive energy being contagious. And that is something that we do notice, that the mirroring can be a real problem if you're in high intensity conflict. But part of why 80-80 works is that as you notice your partner being more generous, there's almost a draw to be more generous too. And it's fun to be in that space. Just yesterday, I happened to be the one on like parent carpool duty. And it was neat that, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through the day, Nate was like, hey, you're doing a lot. Are you sure you don't want me to do something? And I didn't. I felt totally fine about it. It was great. I was happy to do it. But there was that moment of, wait, I want to be contributing, not from a tit for tat, like, oh, shoot, she's going to hold this over me tomorrow, but just it calls forth something great from your partner.
On that, if you can go into radical generosity, and then I'll give you an example from my life how I've been using it actually.
Radical generosity is our word for the 80-80 mindset. And the basic idea is, as we've been describing, that there's this cultural center of gravity when it comes to our relationships, pulling us toward fairness. Radical generosity is a way of exiting that usual momentum that runs in the background of our relationship. And so instead of operating on this motivation of just trying to find the elusive goal of fairness, we're shifting to a very different kind of motivation or intention, where the intention is to do more than your fair share. And the thing about radical generosity is, as Kaley just mentioned, it is counter-habitual. It is countercultural. If you start to tell your friends, like, yeah, I'm trying this thing in my relationship where I do way more than my partner, they'll be like, you're crazy. Like, what do you want to become, a doormat? So it's strange in that sense, because it runs counter to our instincts and counter to our culture. But as Kaley mentioned, there's this way in which it really does open up space for your partner to also become more generous. It's this upward spiral effect that's super powerful. And so that's why we think it's worth trying out. And you can even do it in a stealth way. So it probably isn't going to land very well if you're like, I'm going to be radically generous to you. And didn't you notice how I made coffee for you? And how radically generous was that? That actually probably is going to undermine the impact and the power of it. But if you do it without even telling your partner, it's a kind of a fun experiment to see, like, how do they react? How does it subtly change things? They'll know something's different.
I love, we got an email from Brad Feld after he read the book of the Foundry Group. And he was like, it turns out this is actually easy and fun. So his wife is, she knits, and she had this like big yarn mess. And she was like, I don't knit, not my problem. I don't need to do it. And he was like, wait a second. What if I took 10 minutes and just went upstairs and saw if I could untangle her yarn? Literally 10 minutes. He found the snag, was able to do it. The gratitude, the appreciation that she had for something that for him, he didn't have to, but felt like a stretch toward her. He was like, this is awesome. This is easy. This is fun.
A quick segue away for the interview. If you are interested in living a self-led life and you want to put special focus on your relationship with yourself and relationship with the people you love the most, a little bit like what you've been hearing here from Nate and Kaley Klemp, then the 6-month Strive Method workshop is for you, right? I'm going to teach you in this workshop for 6 months how to live a self-led life, alcohol-free as fuck. You're going to have workshops, quests, quizzes, homework to do. You're going to be there every week on a group coaching call with myself and the other Strive coaches. And you will be in a community of like-minded people who want to live a self-led life, alcohol-free as fuck. Remember, the journey does not stop when you stop drinking alcohol. It begins, okay? So if you want to learn more about the Strive Method workshop, email me at thestrivemethod@gmail.com or WhatsApp me on 0753 789 6829. And that is +44 for the UK in front of that. Okay, so without further ado, back to the Klemps. I think it's great. For me, it really fits into my ethos of living a self-led life, where it's like I want to play the inside out game, right? Like I want to come from inside here. I don't want to rely on outside of myself. So I want to try to lead by example. It's not easy, but I try. In the last couple of days, I have this like little note set up on the side of me with like the 5 things I'm going to do today, what my wins are. And I put on there 2 days ago, 1 act of radical generosity. And 2 days ago, Liza, my wife, and Zia, my 8-year-old daughter, she's home from school. She goes back to school tomorrow. Had a particularly tough day. I was working upstairs and I could hear them shouting and screaming downstairs. And I was triggered, but I was doing my best to not get in a drama triangle, just let them kind of get on with it. And then I was super busy, right? And then I thought, I'm going to go make dinner, because the reason that Liza's so stressed right now is she's trying to do everything and look after Liza. And again, it didn't come from being a martyr. I wasn't below the line in drama. I was above the line. I felt I was in self-energy. I had a lot of compassion for her. And I went and did that. And then today, and I didn't say nothing to her. I just said, I'm making dinner. And then today I went to the coffee shop and I looked at my little note and it said radical generosity. And I just bought her a coffee and brought it home. It's still in the fridge. She never drank it. And again, I didn't say anything. So I'm going to try to do that every day. But not just with Liza, I'm trying to think, how can I do these things for my kids as well?
Yeah.
which I think is pretty cool, right?
One of our discoveries with radical generosity is that sense of positive contagion. So, one of my favorite stories is that we were leaving sticky notes for each other. So, sticky note to remind yourself, we were leaving sticky notes for each other where we were paying attention to what was significant in the other person's day. So there was an act of connection and revealing, but then we would put a sticky note somewhere. They would find it to wish them good luck on whatever it was that they were up to. And our daughter, who at the time was right around 8, she was like, I like this sticky note game. So we would find sticky notes sometimes in inopportune places where they would like fall in the toilet or, fall in the front of the car. But a sticky note that just said, I love you, mom, or good luck today, dad. And then to, hide notes in her lunchbox was just this really beautiful experience of generosity and connectivity that we understood what was happening in one another's lives.
Yeah, I've been looking at Google Photos and digging out really old photos at the beginning of our relationship. And then every morning, because I get up earlier, I'll send it to her and I'll say, good morning, beautiful. She's like, where are you getting these photos from? I just want to draw attention to this because people listening to this might be thinking, this guy's nuts. He's got notes everywhere. Like I'm the type of guy who used to have a note to remind me to tell my kids I love them because I could wake up, I can get into it. And then 12 hours have gone by. Do you come across that a lot? Like people who really have to use structure in order to, access that more feminine, that more nurturing, loving, compassionate aspect of themselves?
You've brought up one of the central controversies in relationships. So I want to really double click on this because there is a school of thought out there that says structure is bad. It's unsexy. It's not loving. Like, why would you bring structure into your relationship? Planning when you have intimacy or planning when you say, I love you, or putting radical generosity on your sticky note. There's this whole school of thought out there that says love should not be structure. Love should be spontaneity. Love should just happen organically. And we happen to completely disagree with that school of thought. We are absolutely in the structural school of thought because for the people we coach, the people who we write books for, they simply don't have the luxury of living in a bungalow on a beach in Fiji where they can allow just like the energy and flow of the moment to like dictate when they have sex or like when they say I love you to their partner. I mean, it sounds cool. And I think it would be awesome. And maybe that's what we should all aspire to. But the reality is in our household, in the households of basically everybody we work with, we interview, et cetera, things are really busy. People have a lot to do. And so the choice is really between hoping spontaneity is going to magically like arise, but then knowing it's not really ever going to happen, or creating a little bit of structure so that you can structure spaces that allow that spontaneity to emerge. So I don't think you have to be against spontaneity. I'm pro spontaneity, but using structure, whether it's in your calendar, whether it's your to-do list, like whatever structural pieces work well for you, you can create space such that those spontaneous moments can arise. And that's really the approach that we take for people who have busy lives, who have kids and can't just sort of like, wing it and hope for the best.
What you touch upon there is something in my work I call white space. So I worked in the rail industry for 20 years. And I remember we had a new CEO from Canada, and the biggest cost was locomotives. So he was like, I need to cut these locomotives out. So he would say to the planners, how much white space do you have in your plan where the locos sitting idle, not doing anything? And I always remember this. And then when I stopped drinking, I suddenly had a lot of white space. I had time on my hands because I wasn't hungover every day. I had mental white space. So then how I filled that was really important, so I could fill it with just random stuff, or I could fill it with like meaning and purpose, right? So for me, I think it's really important. And you're right. Sometimes people are like, well, you can't do that because I'm spontaneous. It's like, well, no, just schedule an hour a day to be spontaneous.
Yes.
And if you think about it, Nate, the people who if you're in a relationship with someone and they say that scheduling is unsexy, it's not going to happen, because they would only say it if they were absolutely spontaneous. And if they were spontaneous, you wouldn't be structuring it. It would just be happening, right? Talk a little bit about, if you will, daily check-ins, and then I will tie in a story actually on scheduling and daily check-ins.
We think about habits as being important components of having a strong relationship. And so there are micro habits, there are sort of, weekly habits, and then there are macro habits. So the daily check-in is an opportunity to do exactly that. What's going on in your day? What's happening so that I can be aligned, so that we're in sync? I know what question to ask you. And it's that chance to reveal. For us to stay in this radically generous mindset, it's not just revealing, hey, I'm mad about whatever the thing is. It's also revealing what's important to you. I think it's interesting that early in our relationships, most people will say, I could just talk to my partner for hours. They were the most interesting human in the world. And then the research is saying now most married couples with children speak to each other for fewer than 5 minutes per day. And that the majority of those 5 minutes are logistics. Are you going to Costco? Who's picking up Junior from baseball practice? And so the daily check-in is to actually be humans together, be in relationship together. Beyond that, we think about weekly habits like having a date night, or true confessions. We don't really do date night, but we're really good at date hike. So we leave our phones and go for a couple of hours out into nature on a trail just to get back in sync with each other, to remember that he's my favorite person in the world. And then we think about the quarterly. Can you do an overnight, or can you do something where it really is about the two of you to let some of that spontaneity arise? But if you don't start micro, it's very hard to build macro, and the daily check-in is an essential piece.
We were doing daily check-ins for a long time, and I found them to be extremely healthy, because if you do it every day and you do it really well, there's no room for resentment, right? Like it's impossible to fester because you're getting it out every day. But just to jump on what Nate said about scheduling, we learned that scheduling your check-ins is really important. So, for example, my wife doesn't want me to talk to her about a daily check-in in the evening once I put my daughter to bed, because she hasn't got the bandwidth. And it took me a while, again, inner child, being activated, being told what to do. Now I just accept that, when that time comes, she doesn't want to do any heavy lifting. So if we can have a check-in, it will be when we drop the daughter off at school, and it's during the daytime. So that's a good example, isn't it, of how scheduling can really help you to improve your relationship.
I also hear that as radical generosity, that there's a need there. And rather than trying to get into a power struggle around, we should do the check-in at the end of the day. Instead, there's generosity to say, I want to meet you where you are. And I would rather have this conversation when you're available and we can really hear and appreciate each other than force my will.
Well, what comes out of that is something that I learned, and I was reflecting on it a lot when I read the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, was I was really fighting for power. And the word I use, and I hear it in so many of my male clients, when I talk about taking 100% responsibility for the way you respond to people, is the part of you that feels like a doormat, especially men. So you start to tell a story in your mind that when you meet your other men and you tell them what's happening in your relationship, they're going to think that you're a doormat and she walks all over you and she controls you. And that was really difficult for me. I didn't realize that me holding on to that was driving such a wedge in our relationship. I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit.
I think about in the drama triangle, it's really interesting that both victim and villain are taking less than 100% responsibility. And so in some ways, this doormat concept of like, oh, well, it's happening to me and I don't want to be asserting and blaming is also less than 100% responsibility. And so I think there's a mindset shift around you could be in resistance, create a lot of conflict, create a lot of blame, and still be out of integrity and 100% responsibility. Is that really worth it? And all of a sudden people are like, oh goodness, that's not what I want.
I just want to add that there are some gender overlays here in our modern context that are important to see as well, where there are even these funny catchphrases like, who's wearing the pants? She's wearing the pants, or you're whipped, right? There's all these different ways of describing a dynamic where one partner has more power than the other partner. And for men who have traditionally been in this position of power, for somebody outside, especially to say like, oh, your wife wears the pants, that's like very disempowering and scary. And so there's a whole gender thing there. And I think the way you get out of that, the way we've tried to get out of that, is to just step out of that paradigm altogether. Like, who wears the pants? We both wear pants. Like, who would not wear pants to your relationship? I mean, maybe that's cool.
Assume, so yeah. Whatever.
No, but like, let's just blow up that whole paradigm. Like, who's the boss? We're the boss. Mm-hmm. And that's that shift from basing everything off of what's best for me. Am I in control? Do I have power? Like, where the whole conversation is framed around me and I, to a conversation that's framed around we and us. And once you shift to that paradigm of we and us, then the question of like, who wears the pants, who's controlling things, who's got the power, it's just not as interesting, because it's way more interesting to think about like, well, we have tremendous power, the two of us together. Especially when we're aligned rather than at all. When we're aligned, like we can do anything. What do we want to do? Yeah. That's such a more interesting conversation, I think.
I think that's all. You're also pointing to something really interesting, both of you, which is this, whether it's inner child or parental modeling or societal hangover, that when we interviewed same-sex couples, they had way less drama around roles and responsibilities and shoulds than heterosexual couples, because they didn't have expectations around, well, only the man is masculine and only the woman is feminine. That instead there was a conversation about what is masculinity and femininity as a complement in a relationship. Where is their structure and flow, rather than needing to be rigid about it. So there's something really beautiful in the unpack there that I think you're pointing to.
Yeah, I definitely remember waking up one moment asking myself the question, do I think that I am the boss in this relationship? And the answer was yes. And then saying, where the hell does that come from? And actually just being vulnerable enough to say to Liza, I have to admit that there's a part of my paradigm here that says that I'm the boss. The way I am getting around it, I'll say, is nervous system regulation. So I find the more I'm in, as Stephen Porges would say, social engagement state in polyvagal theory, the more I'm in social engagement state, the less I care about power dynamics, so my paradigm of I should be the boss, which I assume I got from looking at male role models and societal conditioning, it doesn't bother me. But once I'm in sympathetic nervous system state, man, oh man, all of a sudden that protector part comes out of me, and I want to be that dominant guy again, because it's the only way that certain parts of my psyche know how to protect myself. It's almost like Liza saying to me, Liza coming downstairs, like Zia's going to school tomorrow, right? And thank you, because of your book, I've been able to say to my beautiful wife, can you please make her Zia's lunches? Because I don't care particularly what she eats for her lunch. You really do. And when I do her lunch, because I don't particularly care, I feel this control, right? Like just looking over my shoulder, it feels like she's stabbing me in the back with her sword. That's how powerful it is to my nervous system. To not be in that kitchen tomorrow is going to be bliss. You know what I mean? Like, and I got that from your book. Is this what's in your boat? Yeah. Can you mention that a little bit? What's in your boat?
Yeah, you're alluding to a really essential practice that I think all couples should do, where you are basically taking a step back from that accidental approach we talked about earlier which, by the way, is the approach of about 99% of couples. When we would ask them, how do you determine who makes the lunches in the morning, or who cooks, or who does the dishes, or who takes out the trash? Almost every couple we interviewed would say some version of, we never really thought about it. We just kind of winged it. So we call that the wing it approach. That's the accidental approach. And the problem with the wing it approach is that, to your point, you get in all these very strange situations where you're ending up doing something that your partner is actually better at and your partner wants to do. And then you feel controlled when your partner is like hovering over you and being like, that's your peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? Like that's a bad situation to be in. But when you take the wing it approach, sometimes you end up there and nobody really knows why. So the idea behind a roles exercise is to simply say, what if we were to take a step out of our current system and just design this thing from scratch? And rather than designing it around accident, let's design it around, hey, what do we both enjoy doing? What do we not enjoy doing? What are we good at? Where do we have a higher service level where, I want a cleaner floor than Kaley does or something like that? And then also, are there things we hate that we could outsource? If so, like, why are we doing that? So it's a really powerful exercise to do. And one way people can do it, obviously we have it in the book, but you can also just put 2 pieces of paper down, write out all of your roles individually, each of you that you have today. And then with the other piece of paper, that's your opportunity to have a conversation and dream about, like, what if we did this more intentionally? What could this look like?
The boat specifically is, once you know who's doing what, it's look at all of the things and imagine that they're on a boat. And what most people find in today's busy world is that if you actually put it all on one piece of paper and we draw it as a boat on purpose, just for the visual effect, you go, oh my goodness, no wonder we feel overwhelmed. Our boat is sinking. There's way too much on this boat for this particular vessel to carry. And so then the question with the 2 of you intentionally is a lot of what Nate was saying. What do we want to throw overboard? What do we want to downsize? Where do we say this actually isn't our priority? And that's where boundaries become so important. A willingness to say no. You are certainly well versed in how important it is to be able to have clean yeses and nos, and noticing where societal pressure shows up. Even to be able to say, my parents are coming back from having been away on a trip. And we said, that's terrific. We'd love to host you for dinner. And then the email comes in that says, well, how about we also go for a hike? And recognizing
then do dinner.
And in the moment, it would be easier to appease and to say, sure, it takes discipline to be able to pause and really think about what are our joint priorities, and then have the boundary to say, gosh, that won't work. We'd love to join you at dinner. Or to say, I would love to go hiking, and then have Nate and Jay come with us to dinner too, without accidentally signing each other up for things that we don't want, having you make lunch in a way that's terrible, having both of us be in places we don't want to be. So it's all this notion of intentionality. We just did 3 exercises in one, by the way.
Yes, I love it. I love it. This is where all your things intertwine and work really well, because when I introduced the concept of having a look at what roles me and Liza had, taking ownership of certain ones, and trying to get rid of as much shared responsibility as we could, I got a lot of blowback from Liza. Like she didn't want to go in. She was a few things she was happy with, but then it was like, actually, you're going too far. Like I don't think we need this. That then allowed me to go into reveal, to say, okay, I know you think we don't need this. However, I get really resentful over this activity when I perceive you're controlling me. So if you just took it, I wouldn't have that resentment. As long as you want to take it, I wouldn't have that resentment. And then I think we've got one less problem that is going to maybe, cause a conflict. Do you know what I mean? So I love the way that you're able to kind of like, blend them all and use them all, so to speak. I have a question for you. You did a ton of research for this book, spoke to so many people. Did alcohol, given my audience, did alcohol ever come up as an issue in your discussions with people?
We did have several interviews where addiction and alcohol came up. And I will say that it brought up a very distinctive form of fairness. So we like to talk about fairness as something that's kind of invisible, often in the background. So it's helpful to point out how it shows up. Sometimes it shows up as domestic work, childcare. I'm doing more there. Sometimes it shows up around money. I'm saving more and you're spending all our money. Sometimes it shows up around free time. Like, how did you have time to go for a run and go to the gym when I was at Target? Right? And especially with kids, that one shows up. The alcohol piece showed up at a more macro level. So one couple, for example, the man in the partnership had struggled with alcoholism for years. And so it wasn't just, hey, there were a few bad days. It was like, hey, there were 5 years where you weren't even here. You were just completely MIA. And I was doing everything I could to hold this ship together. And that is it's its own flavor of fairness, because as you can hear behind that, it's like, there's a way in which you kind of owe me, because for 5 years I was there and I stayed with this and you did literally nothing. So that's a way in which it can show up. And that's a really tricky dynamic for a couple to work through themselves. There may be some couples that can do that, but that's one of those places where you alluded to sinkholes and pothole problems being like, who has more time on a Saturday afternoon, me or you? We could probably figure that out between the two of us. A sinkhole problem is a problem where it's so deep, you really do need some help to navigate your way out of that. And I would say that situation I just alluded to of addiction and, years of unfairness, that's one where you probably are going to need to have some support from the outside to help you navigate that dynamic and figure out how you come back after something like that. I'm curious though, having had some of your own experiences, how does that resonate? Are there other ways in which it might show up?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually, it's interesting you talked about that, because one of the questions I was going to ask you, because I see this a lot in my work, is when people can't let go of the story. So sometimes I think the past is a story. So let's say, using alcohol as an example, I'll just use myself as an example, actually. So I think that I am perfectly imperfect. A good example that I use actually is I love my daughter probably more than anybody other than my wife, yet I hurt her and have hurt her more than anybody in her life, and probably will continue to be that bad guy until she gets into a relationship with someone else who probably take over that role. And I accept that in all my humanness, and I don't have any guilt or shame, because the context of how I show up as a father is more important than the content, right? Type of thing. But what I find is, so I don't hold on to stories per se, but I think it's easy for my wife and my ex-wife to be saying, this is who you are, when every single day I wake up, I'm changing. And so I personally find that very difficult. And I see that a lot in the work with my clients, where people aren't allowed to get past their problems of the past because there's a forgiveness piece missing. There's a resentment piece that is too powerful. And obviously that takes coaching, therapy, and also a real vulnerability for the relationship as a whole, I guess. So it's really important for me, when my wife goes into story, to hold a space where that's okay for her to do that and to not make it wrong, because then she'll start to feel unsafe again. So it's really difficult. It's really difficult to navigate. One of the biggest problems, though, I find in the alcohol space is probably codependency around the consumption of alcohol. Usually I get a lot of couples who both have alcohol problems, and one of them really struggles to quit because the other one won't stop. and then they both quit together really, really well. And then one starts again and the other one starts. So I'm interested in your views around what you've come across when there's a real, it's almost like it's like a game changer, right? Like, what do you do when you get to a point in a relationship where there's a non-negotiable that can't be a non-negotiable? So Liza doesn't, very, very rarely drinks. If she suddenly started drinking again and knocking it back, and like, I'd have a real problem with that. It would be a non-negotiable. And how would I navigate that? Like, I'm not quite sure. Like, so it doesn't have to be alcohol, right? It could be anything. Like, how would you educate or help or guide people in that sense?
For the two of us and for 80-80 as 80-80 marriage as a concept, we are pro working in the relationship and on the relationship, and believe that intimate relationship can be one of the most powerful and beautiful crucibles to understand your own stuff, to take responsibility, to make amends, to forgive. All of that happens in the dynamic of a relationship differently from other places in your life. And there can be a moment, and we think it's really important to be able to acknowledge there are non-negotiables, and they are different for different couples. That in your relationship where Liza to start drinking, that's a non-negotiable. That's different in a couple where perhaps there hasn't been addiction. But for people to be able to be explicit around and articulate about, these are my non-negotiables, these are my boundaries, and to feel like there is the ability to change a relationship or sometimes leave a relationship, allows it to stay in a place of health. We don't think that it's useful for people to be involuntarily trapped in a relationship. We think that that takes away certainly 100% responsibility and some of the awareness and growth that's possible. So I think you've named that it's important to be able to navigate that conflict, but also to recognize sometimes difficult choices are needing to be made. And that's also a moment where we highly encourage work with a coach, a therapist, a pastor, a rabbi, someone who can help you navigate this well, a sponsor.
Yeah, and again, the whole daily check-ins to reveal, what I sense quite deeply at the heart of your work is communication, effective, almost like the goal for world-class communication. I mean, it's actually not just in your relationships, right? Just look at the world today. If people could communicate in a more from above the line, and from a state of compassion, love, and empathy, it allows you to witness. Like, what did I learn of Alain de Botton from A School of Life? He's like, the reason we upset the people the closest to us is because we trust that they won't leave us, so we show them the worst parts of ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I really believe in that. So, like, if Liza is really super triggering me and touching all my buttons and being the parts of herself which I in the past wish she wasn't, I have to learn to love them. I have to learn to allow her to be those parts of herself. I see my 8-year-old the same. Like right now, I need to allow her to shout at me, to scream at me, to say she hates me. I need all of that to be okay because she's a human being, right? And that, with all the cultural conditioning and the habituation, and I'm 49 now, like you've got like 40 odd years of being a certain way. It's hard, but thanks to people like yourselves and great books like the 80-80 Marriage, you're giving people a lot of tools, and for me, frameworks which I can really put in some systems, and really, I love it. I love being able to go to my wife and saying, hey, do you want to try this 7-day sex challenge? Let's talk about it. And for her to be like, yeah. And I'm like, boom. you know what I mean? And she's like, oh, you're happy. And then after day 2, I'm the one who flunks it, right? Like,
that's awesome.
I love all that stuff. So nice. Just tell the people at home, what are you up to now? How can they get a hold of you? What are you up to?
Yeah, the best way to learn more about our work is our website, 8080marriage.com. So 8080marriage.com. We have a free newsletter that we send out once every couple of weeks with new tools, new ideas, new practices you can use. So that's a cool thing to sign up for. Obviously the book is out. You can get it anywhere books are sold. We're also on Instagram, 8080 Marriage on Instagram. And there's a new project that may be coming out in a couple of years on relationships that we're working on. So stay tuned for that.
Well, thank you for all the work you're doing. I think it's amazing. If anything, your work has really helped me to change my relationship with myself, which is like the key thing, because then I can show up in a different space with my kids and my wife. So thank you very much. And I really appreciate your time today. I really do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a
appreciate
pleasure.
it. Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. Just a few thank yous. First of all, I want to thank you guys and girls for listening to this podcast and being supporters of it. Many people stop drinking alcohol just by listening to this podcast. I get a lot of people reaching out to me, thanking me for that, right? So give this to somebody as a gift today, or rate and review the podcast. If you can rate and review the podcast on your local podcast player and tell somebody about it, you could change somebody's life today, okay? So thank you for listening, and thank you in advance for that piece of service. Also want to thank our producer, Stan. Stan is still currently in the Ukraine, fighting the war and producing our podcast while his family is somewhere else in the world right now, okay, apart from him. So everybody send out your prayers and your love. Stan, we love you. Thank you very much for everything you do here. For you out there, if you are starting to think about, contemplate, reflect on your relationship with alcohol, you do not have to do this alone. Yes, you drink alone, but you don't have to stop alone, okay? And if alcohol is not your thing, but you are starting to feel that you actually are living a parts-led life, the ego is getting in the way too much, so you're not happy with the way life is going, then reach out to us at thestrivemethod@gmail.com. Just say, Lee, and just tell me what is on your mind, and we'll start to have that conversation. Strive community is a beautiful place where you can start to feel seen, heard, and matter. It's where you can get community, and it's where you can start practicing what we call the 8 C's of self, our core values, right? Of creativity, curiosity, connection, compassion, courage. I can't remember the rest of them, but there's 8 of them, right? And we have our quest structured. So we have assignments, and they're really interesting, exciting. At the end of them, we say to you, come on, do this quest, right? Get involved in this challenge. And strivers are really finding it exciting, and they're working their challenges in these areas that are going to increase the amount of time they spend in self-energy, in a state of flow. And that has amazing repercussions for the relationship you grow with yourself, and for how you reach out to others in their life, like how you parent, how you are as a child to your, not child, but a son or a daughter, how you are in the relationship with the person you share your bed with, and how you behave with your employees, right? So reach out to me at strivemethod@gmail.com if you want to learn more. Okay, much love, everybody.